The city was alive with its usual hum, cars honking, people rushing, the distant wail of a siren breaking through the air. Among the chaos, a young woman in her mid-20s stood proudly beside her sleek, black luxury car. It wasn't just any car. It was her dream turned into reality. Every inch of the polished exterior gleamed under the sun, a symbol of years of hard work and perseverance. She'd saved every dollar, worked extra shifts, and ignored countless doubters who said someone like her could never afford a car like that. But here it was, a testament to her grit and determination. As she prepared to head to her next destination, the sound of heavy boots on pavement caught her attention. Turning around, she saw a police officer approaching with a purposeful stride. He was tall, with a broad build, his badge glinting under the same sunlight that danced off her car. At first, she thought nothing of it. After all, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She offered a polite smile, but it wasn't returned. "Is this your car?" he asked, his tone sharp, bordering on accusatory. She blinked, startled by the hostility in his voice. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. "Mind showing me some proof of ownership?" he pressed. Confused but compliant, she reached into her bag for the registration papers, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid any misunderstanding. As she handed them over, he snatched the documents without so much as a thank you, his eyes narrowing as he read. "This car is a little too nice for someone like you," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. The words hit like a slap, but she kept her composure. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I worked hard for this car. Everything is in order." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he walked around the vehicle, inspecting it as if searching for an excuse to escalate the situation. When he returned to her side, he gave a curt nod toward the passenger seat. "Step away from the car." Her stomach dropped. "Why? What's going on?" "I'm impounding it," he said flatly, as though it was a routine matter. She froze, her mind racing. "Impounding it? On what grounds? I haven't done anything wrong." Ignoring her protests, the officer reached into his pocket, pulling out a set of keys. To her horror, he climbed into the driver's seat as though the car already belonged to him. Panic surged through her. This couldn't be happening. "Officer, this is my car," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You can't just take it." He didn't even look at her. Instead, he revved the engine, the powerful hum of the car mocking her helplessness. With a smug grin, he said, "You can file a complaint if you want. Good luck with that." And just like that, he sped off, leaving her standing on the curb, stunned and furious. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, determined to report the theft. But deep down, she knew the odds weren't in her favor. It wasn't the first time someone in authority had abused their power, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As the officer zipped through traffic, a self-satisfied smirk played on his lips. He couldn't believe his luck. A car like this. It was a dream ride, and now it was his. At least for the time being. He had no intention of taking it to the impound lot right away. No, he wanted to enjoy the luxury for a while, maybe even show it off to a few friends. But as he turned onto a quiet stretch of road, something strange happened. The car's dashboard flickered, and an unfamiliar voice crackled through the speakers. "Unauthorized user detected," the voice announced, calm yet menacing. The officer frowned, glancing at the screen. "What the?" he muttered, tapping the controls. But the buttons didn't respond. Instead, the doors locked with a chilling click. "Return the vehicle immediately," the voice commanded, its tone sharp and unyielding. His smug grin vanished, replaced by a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the car seemed to take on a life of its own. The steering wheel resisted his grip, pulling sharply to the side and forcing him off the main road. "What's going on?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The car didn't answer. Instead, it sped up, the engine roaring as it veered onto a desolate stretch of road. The once confident officer was now a prisoner in the very car he had stolen. He fumbled for his radio, desperate to call for backup, but the signal was dead. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was completely at the mercy of this machine, and whoever controlled it. Back in the city, the young woman stood near a small coffee shop, her phone pressed to her ear. Her expression was a mix of anger and determination as she spoke in hushed tones. "He took it," she said, her voice tight, "just like we thought he might." The person on the other end responded calmly, their words inaudible to anyone nearby. But whatever they said brought a faint smile to her lips, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark moment. "Good," she replied. "Let's see how he likes being on the other side." Meanwhile, the officer's ride had turned into a nightmare. The car's speedometer climbed higher and higher, the landscape outside a blur. He screamed for help, banging on the windows, but there was no one around to hear him. The voice returned, colder this time. "Did you think there would be no consequences?" it asked. "Actions have repercussions." The officer's mind raced. Who was behind this? How was it even possible? But there was no time to think. The car skidded to a halt in an empty field, throwing him forward against the seatbelt. Before he could catch his breath, the engine roared to life again, and the car spun in circles, faster and faster, as though mocking his helplessness. Finally, the car stopped, its doors unlocking with a soft click. Trembling, the officer stumbled out, falling to his knees. His heart pounded as he gasped for air, the distant hum of the car's engine fading into the wind. He was alive, but his pride, and his sense of invincibility, was shattered. Somewhere, miles away, the young woman received a text message. She glanced at it, her smile widening. "It's done," it read. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, the weight of justice, though unconventional, lifting a burden from her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, she'd take the small victory. The officer staggered to his feet, his legs wobbling beneath him like a newborn fawn. His hands trembled as he wiped the cold sweat from his brow. His head darted around the empty field, searching for any sign of what had just happened. The car was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. He pulled out his phone, but the screen was frozen, refusing to respond no matter how hard he jabbed at it. Frustration bubbled inside him, but it was overpowered by something deeper: fear. He thought back to the girl, and the way she'd protested as he drove off with her car. There had been no threats, no screaming. Just a calm determination in her voice that unnerved him now. Did she know something he didn't? Had she done something to the car? The thought made him shiver. The officer started walking back toward the road, his steps uneven on the uneven ground. As he moved, he replayed the last 20 minutes in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. The voice in the car, was it real? Could it have been some kind of advanced security system? But even as he tried to convince himself of that, the deeper part of him knew there was something far stranger at play. Meanwhile, back in the city, the young woman was busy making her next move. She wasn't the type to sit back and wait for things to resolve themselves. Her life had taught her that justice wasn't handed out freely. You had to fight for it. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. She sat in a small cafe, her laptop open in front of her. The screen displayed a series of files and messages, all encrypted and carefully organized. She tapped her fingers against the table, her mind racing. She knew the officer wouldn't take this lying down. Men like him never did. He'd come looking for answers, for a way to regain control. But she was ready. A familiar face appeared on the cafe's small security camera feed. A man entered and scanned the room before walking over to her table. He slid into the seat across from her, his expression calm but focused. "It's done," she said quietly, glancing up at him. "I figured," he replied, his voice low. "But we need to move fast. This won't stay quiet for long." She nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I've already started compiling the evidence, the recordings, the footage, everything. We're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what happened." The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "And what if he tries to flip it on you? You know how these things go. People like him always find a way to twist the narrative." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away from the screen. "That's why we're going to be smart about this. No mistakes, no loose ends. If he thinks he can intimidate me, he's in for a surprise." Out in the field, the officer finally made it back to the main road. He flagged down a passing car, its driver eyeing him suspiciously before rolling down the window. "You okay, officer?" the driver asked, glancing at the sweat-soaked uniform and the wild look in his eyes. "I need a ride to the station," he said, his voice sharp. The driver hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, hop in." As the officer climbed into the passenger seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there, just the empty stretch of road behind them. At the station, he wasted no time. He stormed into the building, barking orders and demanding answers. His colleagues looked at him with raised eyebrows, but no one dared to question his tone. "I want every available resource on this," he growled. "That car didn't just disappear. Someone's messing with me, and I'm going to find out who." But as the hours dragged on, frustration turned into something else. Doubt. The car wasn't in the system, and no one could explain what had happened. Surveillance footage from the city streets showed the car disappearing into thin air. Every lead he followed seemed to hit a dead end, and the harder he pushed, the more it felt like he was chasing shadows. Back in her apartment, the young woman sat in front of a wall covered in photos, documents, and maps. Strings connected key pieces of information, creating a web of truth she was determined to expose. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, her friend's voice crackling through the line. "He's digging," her friend said, "but he's not going to find anything. We've covered our tracks." "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "But we're not done yet. This isn't just about the car. It's about what he represents." Her friend sighed. "You sure you're ready for this? Once we go public, there's no turning back." She glanced at the largest photo on the wall, a picture of her standing in front of her car, smiling proudly. It was taken the day she'd bought it, a moment she'd dreamed of for years. But now, that smile felt like a distant memory, replaced by a fire that burned in her chest. "I'm ready," she said firmly. The officer, meanwhile, sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. His confidence was unraveling, replaced by a growing sense of paranoia. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out to get him, but he couldn't prove it. And that terrified him. As night fell, he made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for answers to come to him. He'd find her, confront her, and get to the bottom of this. He didn't know how, but he was certain she was involved. But as he stepped outside, his phone buzzed. A text message lit up the screen, its words sending a chill down his spine. "You thought you could take what wasn't yours. Now it's your turn to lose." He looked around, but the street was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the air felt heavier. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the phone. Back in her apartment, the young woman watched the screen on her laptop. A live feed showed the officer pacing outside the station, his movements frantic. She leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Game on," she whispered. The tension between them was building, each move and counter-move drawing them closer to an inevitable confrontation. The officer thought he was hunting her, but in reality, he was the one being led. The young woman had spent her life fighting battles like this, and she wasn't about to lose now. As the city slept, the wheels of justice, or something like it, were set in motion. Both sides were preparing for what was to come, their lives intertwined in a game far more dangerous than either of them fully understood. And while neither knew exactly how it would end, one thing was certain. The truth would come out, And when it did, it would change everything. The officer's steps echoed against the pavement as he made his way down the dimly lit street. The message on his phone replayed in his mind like a broken record. His heart raced with each glance over his shoulder, convinced that someone was lurking just out of sight. The city that once felt like his domain now seemed foreign and threatening, its quiet streets hiding secrets in every shadow. He had always been the one in control, the one who could intimidate and command. But now the roles were shifting, and he didn't know how to stop it. He reached his car and hesitated, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. The street was empty, but the silence felt unnatural. Sliding into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and started the engine. His plan was simple: go to her neighborhood and watch. If she was involved, she'd slip up. He just needed to catch her in the act. The drive felt longer than usual, his mind swirling with paranoia and unanswered questions. The car's headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating empty sidewalks and parked cars. He turned onto her street and slowed down, his eyes scanning the windows of her building. Inside, the young woman was calm but focused. Her phone sat on the table, its screen displaying a map with a blinking dot. She watched as the dot moved closer, her plan falling into place with every step he took. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure he never had the power to hurt anyone again. She walked to her living room window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The officer's car was parked across the street, its engine idling. She smirked, her heart steady. She'd been waiting for this moment, and now it was finally here. The officer leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on her building. His hand hovered over his phone, debating whether to call for backup. But how could he explain this? That a stolen car seemed to vanish and reappear at will. That a cryptic message had sent him spiraling into paranoia. He'd be a laughingstock. No, this was something he needed to handle on his own. Minutes turned into an hour, and the stillness of the night only added to his unease. He glanced at the time on his dashboard and sighed. Just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. Across the street. The truth is waiting for you. His stomach tightened as he looked toward her building. The lights on the second floor flickered, drawing his attention like a moth to a flame. Against his better judgment, he opened the car door and stepped out. The young woman watched from her window as he crossed the street. She moved to her laptop, pressing a key that activated the next phase of her plan. Downstairs, the officer entered the building and climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected, answers, maybe, or even a confrontation. But when he knocked, the door swung open on its own. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of a single screen in the living room. It played a video on a loop, the sound barely audible. He stepped inside, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. The video showed a grainy surveillance feed of him taking the car. His chest tightened as he realized the girl had been watching the entire time. But there was more. The footage shifted to clips of him yelling at civilians, using his badge to intimidate, and cutting corners when it suited him. Every moment was captured, every indiscretion laid bare. A voice broke through the silence, calm and measured. You thought you could take what you wanted without consequences, but you were wrong. The officer turned toward the voice, his pulse pounding in his ears. She stood in the doorway of another room, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of another screen. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. She stepped forward, her expression unflinching. "I want you to understand what it feels like to be powerless, to have something taken from you just because someone thinks they can. But more than that, I want you to face the truth about who you are." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always justified his actions, telling himself he was just doing his job. But now, seeing it all laid out in front of him, he couldn't deny what he'd become. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he said, his voice breaking. "I have connections. People who will back me up. Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. That might have worked before. But now, the world is watching. She motioned to the screen, and the video feed switched to a live stream. Thousands of comments flooded the chat, the words moving too fast to read. His face was plastered across the screen, his actions exposed for all to see. Panic set in as he lunged toward her, but she stepped back, holding up a small device. "Careful," she warned. "One wrong move, and this gets sent to every news outlet in the country." He froze, his breathing ragged. "Why are you doing this?" Her eyes softened just for a moment. "Because people like you think you're untouchable. You think the rules don't apply to you. But they do. And it's time someone reminded you of that." The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity. The officer's mind raced, searching for a way out, but every option led to the same conclusion. He was trapped. Outside, the faint sound of sirens broke the silence, growing louder with each passing moment. The officer's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "You called them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "It's over. You can either face this head-on or run. But either way, the truth is out." The officer's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, regret, and anger. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless, and it terrified him. The young woman watched him for a moment before turning away, her job done. As she walked toward the window, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, triumph, and a lingering sadness. She hadn't set out to destroy him, but to hold him accountable. And now, the world would decide his fate. The sirens grew deafening as police cars pulled up outside the building. The officer's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, but he knew there was no one left to call. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. And in that moment, as the weight of his actions came crashing down around him, he realized that begging for mercy wouldn't change a thing. The officer sat frozen on the floor as the sirens outside grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights now visible through the window. He could hear the distant sound of car doors slamming and muffled voices. Backup had arrived. His first instinct was to get up, to plead his case, but his body refused to move. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on him, leaving him immobilized. The young woman stood near the window, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions inside her. She could see the other officers gathering outside, their radios crackling as they coordinated. She knew what this moment represented: a chance to show the world that power didn't make someone untouchable. Yet, as she glanced back at the man slumped on the floor, something unexpected stirred within her. A part of her wondered if she'd gone too far, if she'd crossed a line she couldn't return from. The front door of the building opened, and heavy footsteps echoed up the stairwell. The officer's breathing quickened, panic gripping him. He turned his gaze to the woman, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Please, you don't understand. This isn't who I am." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Isn't it? Because everything I've seen says otherwise." The footsteps grew louder, closer. The other officers were seconds away, and the tension in the room was suffocating. But before they could reach the apartment, something unexpected happened. The live stream suddenly cut out, the screen going dark. The officer blinked, confused, as the woman frowned and rushed to her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, but nothing responded. "No," she muttered under her breath. "This isn't right." The officer's fear shifted to curiosity. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice still shaky. She didn't answer, her focus entirely on the unresponsive computer. It wasn't just the stream. The entire system had been shut down remotely. A chill ran down her spine as she realized what this meant. Someone else was involved. The pounding on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Police, open up." The voice was authoritative, demanding immediate compliance. The officer's head jerked toward the door, his heart pounding. "You have to let me explain," he said, desperation creeping into his tone. If they see me like this, it's over for me. She hesitated, her mind racing. The plan had been airtight. She'd accounted for every variable. Or so she thought. But now, with someone else pulling strings behind the scenes, everything was spiraling out of control. The pounding came again, louder this time. "Open the door now, or we're coming in." She glanced back at the officer, his eyes wide with fear, and then at the door. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a nearby blanket and tossed it at him. "Hide. Now." Without a word, he scrambled to his feet and dove behind the couch, wrapping himself in the blanket to blend in with the shadows. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, before unlocking the door and opening it just enough to peer out. 3 officers stood in the hallway, their faces stern. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this apartment," one of them said, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. "Mind if we take a look?" She forced a smile, her voice calm. "Suspicious activity? I'm not sure what you're talking about. It's just me here." The lead officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Do you mind if we come in and check? Just to be sure." Her heart raced, but she nodded, stepping aside to let them in. The officers entered, their eyes scanning the room. One of them noticed the still glowing laptop on the table and walked over to inspect it. "What's this?" he asked, motioning to the dark screen. "Just some work stuff," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm a freelance editor. Late-night projects, you know how it is." The officer frowned but didn't press further. Another officer moved toward the couch, and her breath caught in her throat. She watched as he bent down, his hand brushing against the blanket. Before he could investigate further, the lead officer's radio crackled to life. "We've got a situation downtown. All units requested." The officer straightened up, his attention shifting to the urgent call. "We'll have to cut this short," he said, motioning for the others to follow him. "Stay safe, and if you see anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call." She nodded, relief washing over her as they filed out of the apartment. Once the door was closed and locked, she let out a shaky breath and turned to the couch. "You can come out now," she said. The officer emerged, his face pale. "I don't understand. Why are you helping me?" She didn't answer immediately, her thoughts a jumble. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "Because this isn't how I wanted things to go. I wanted justice, not this." He stared at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Justice? You think this is justice?" Her eyes narrowed. "Do you have any idea how many people you've hurt? How many lives you've ruined because you thought you were above the law?" He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew she was right. Before either of them could say more, the laptop beeped, drawing their attention. She rushed over, her eyes widening as she read the new message on the screen. "Nice try, but you're playing a much bigger game now." Her hands clenched into fists as she read the words again. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to interfere. They were escalating the stakes. The officer moved to stand beside her, reading the message over her shoulder. "What does that mean?" She shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, but whoever they are, they're not done with us." As if on cue, the laptop screen flickered and displayed a live feed of another location. The image showed a warehouse, its exterior illuminated by floodlights. Figures moved in and out, their faces obscured. A message appeared beneath the feed. "Come alone. Bring the truth." The officer looked at her, his fear replaced by a grim determination. "Looks like we don't have a choice." She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "Then let's finish this." Without another word, they grabbed what they needed and headed for the door, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. The night air was cold as they approached the warehouse. Its looming structure was both intimidating and eerie under the harsh glow of the floodlights. The woman gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as the car rolled to a stop a few blocks away. Neither of them spoke during the drive. The tension was palpable, each lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them inside. The officer shifted uneasily in his seat, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low. "Whoever's behind this, they're dangerous. You've already done enough." She glanced at him, her expression firm. "If I don't, this doesn't end. Whoever's pulling the strings won't stop until they've silenced both of us. And besides, it's not just about you or me anymore. This is bigger than us." Reluctantly, he nodded, knowing she was right. They stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. She carried a small recording device tucked in her pocket, while he kept his hands visible, hoping to show he wasn't a threat. The faint hum of machinery could be heard from the warehouse as they approached, and shadows moved along the walls, indicating they weren't alone. They paused outside the main door, exchanging a final glance. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, and pushed the door open. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of stacked crates and dimly lit corridors. The live feed had given them no indication of where to go, but a faint flicker of light at the far end of the room drew them forward. As they walked, a voice echoed from unseen speakers, cold and calculated. "You're persistent. I'll give you that. But persistence doesn't always lead to survival." The officer's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice chuckled darkly. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is the message. You've lived your lives with a sense of entitlement, thinking justice is something you can claim or control. Tonight, you learned that justice isn't yours to define." They reached the light source, a single bowl hanging over a table. On it rested a small, unmarked laptop. The screen lit up as they approached, displaying a countdown. 10 minutes. Beneath it, a message flashed. "Expose or perish." The woman's heart raced as she stared at the screen. "Expose what?" she muttered, frustration mounting. "What do they want from us?" The officer leaned closer, scanning the table. His gaze fell on a small USB drive lying next to the laptop. Without thinking, he picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "This has to be it," he said. "Whatever they're after, it's on here." Before she could respond, the voice returned. "Ah, you've found the key. But are you brave enough to use it?" The countdown ticked down to 9 minutes. Her mind raced as she weighed their options. "We don't even know what's on this thing," she said, her voice trembling. "What if it's a trap? What if this is all just another way to manipulate us?" He hesitated, then placed the USB into the laptop's port. The screen flickered, and a series of files appeared, each one labeled with dates, locations, and names. As they scrolled through the documents, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. These weren't just random records. They were evidence of corruption, cover-ups, and crimes committed by people in power, including members of the officer's own precinct. He staggered back, his face pale. This can't be real," he whispered. "These are people I've worked with, people I trusted." The woman's eyes narrowed as she clicked through the files. "It's real," she said grimly. "And it's exactly why they're doing this. Whoever's behind this doesn't want the truth coming out. They're trying to make an example out of us." The countdown hit 7 minutes. The officer shook his head, his breathing uneven. "If we release this, it's over for them. But it's over for me too. My career, my life. It'll all be gone." She turned to him, her voice steady. "Your life as you knew it might be over. But maybe that's a good thing. You wanted to make things right, didn't you? This is your chance." The countdown hit 5 minutes. The tension in the room was unbearable. He stared at the screen, then at her, his mind racing. Finally, he nodded. "Let's do it." She clicked on the largest file and hit upload, the progress bar crawling as precious seconds ticked away. The voice returned, colder than before. "You've made your choice. Let's see if you can live with the consequences." The door behind them slammed open, and a group of masked figures stormed in, weapons drawn. The officer moved to shield her, but she shoved him aside, grabbing a nearby crate and toppling it into their path. The distraction bought them a few precious seconds, but the figures were relentless, closing in fast. The upload hit 50%. The officer grabbed a metal pipe from the floor, holding it defensively. "We can't let them stop this," he shouted. She nodded, her focus remaining on the screen as she ducked behind the table for cover. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of shouting and clanging metal echoing off the walls. The officer fought with everything he had, his movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He knew he was outmatched, but he didn't care. All that mattered was buying her enough time. The upload hit 90%. One of the masked figures lunged toward the laptop, but she intercepted them, knocking them off balance with a heavy swing of her arm. Her heart pounded as she glanced at the screen. 95%, 96%, 97%. Just as the progress bar hit 100%, a deafening explosion rocked the warehouse. The force of it threw them both to the ground, and the screen went dark. When the dust settled, the masked figures were gone, and the warehouse was eerily silent. She pushed herself to her feet, coughing as she waved away the smoke. The officer lay nearby, bruised but conscious. "Did it work?" he asked weakly. She grabbed the laptop, her hand shaking as she checked the screen. A single message appeared: "Truth uploaded. Good luck." Her knees buckled with relief. It was over, or so she thought. As they stumbled out of the warehouse, sirens blaring in the distance, her phone buzzed with a new notification. She unlocked it to find a video from an unknown number. It was footage of her and the officer inside the warehouse, fighting off the masked figures. The accompanying message sent chills down her spine. "This is just the beginning." She looked at the officer, her face pale. "We might have won tonight, but this fight is far from over." The walk to safety felt endless. Every step was weighed down by exhaustion and uncertainty about what came next. The warehouse loomed behind them, its shattered windows and smoldering debris, a stark reminder of the night's events. They found themselves on a quiet street, far enough from the chaos to finally catch their breath. The officer leaned against a lamppost, wincing as he touched the gash on his arm. "We did it," he said, though his voice carried no triumph. It was a hollow victory, tinged with the understanding that their lives had irreversibly changed. The woman stared at her phone, the ominous message still glowing on the screen. She read it again, hoping for some clarity, but the words stayed the same. "This is just the beginning." She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent it was still watching, waiting to strike again. "What now?" he asked, his tone heavy with uncertainty. She tucked her phone into her pocket and looked at him. "We keep going. They wanted us to be afraid, to stay silent. But we've already shown them we won't back down. The truth is out there now. We can't let them scare us into hiding." Her determination was unwavering, and for the first time that night, he felt a glimmer of hope. Still, the road ahead seemed impossibly difficult. The files they had uploaded were damning, but they were just the first step in a much larger battle. The system they had exposed wouldn't go down without a fight. By the time they reached the safety of her apartment, dawn was breaking over the city. The pale light cast long shadows across the room as they settled in, trying to piece together their next move. She pulled out her laptop, checking the platform where the files had been uploaded. To her relief, the evidence was already gaining traction. Comments poured in, people demanding accountability and promising to stand with them. "Look," she said, turning the screen toward him. "It's starting." He nodded, though his expression remained somber. "Starting is one thing. Finishing is another. They're going to come after us, legally, financially, maybe even worse." She met his gaze, her eyes firm. "Then we'll be ready." In the days that followed, the evidence sparked a firestorm of controversy. News outlets picked up the story, and public pressure mounted for an investigation. Protesters filled the streets, demanding justice and reforms. The woman and the officer became unlikely symbols of courage, though neither of them had sought the spotlight. The officer faced immediate fallout. He was suspended from the force pending an internal review, and his former colleagues wasted no time distancing themselves from him. Some even accused him of fabricating the evidence to cover his own mistakes. It stung, but he knew it was the price of doing what was right. She, too, found herself under scrutiny. Her name and face were splashed across headlines, and reporters camped outside her apartment, eager for a statement. Threatening messages flooded her inbox, but so did messages of support. For every voice trying to silence her, there were 10 more encouraging her to keep fighting. Despite the chaos, the two of them remained focused. They worked tirelessly with journalists and activists, ensuring the evidence reached as many people as possible. Their bond grew stronger, forged in the crucible of shared struggle. They weren't just allies anymore. They were friends, bound by a mutual commitment to seeing this through. The threats escalated as the movement gained momentum. One night, a brick shattered her window, a chilling reminder of the risks they were taking. The officer moved into her spare room, unwilling to leave her unprotected. Together, they kept watch, always alert for the next attack. But for every act of intimidation, there was a victory. Lawmakers announced plans to introduce new reforms, and several high-ranking officials implicated in the files were forced to resign. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. Months passed, and the world didn't forget. The woman and the officer continued their work, though they longed for a day when they could return to their normal lives. The movement they had ignited was bigger than them now, carried forward by countless others who shared their vision of justice. One evening, as they sat on her balcony overlooking the city, the officer broke the silence. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "All the risks we took, everything we gave up." She considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I wish it hadn't come to this. I wish the system had worked the way it was supposed to, so we wouldn't have had to do what we did. But I don't regret standing up. I don't regret fighting for what's right." He nodded, her words resonating deeply. "Neither do I." The scars of their journey were permanent, but so were the changes they had brought about. They had faced the system and refused to back down, proving that even ordinary people could make a difference when they stood together. And though the fight was far from over, they had shown the world what was possible. As the city lights sparkled below them, she reached for her phone, scrolling through the latest updates. The movement was still growing, fueled by new voices and new stories. They weren't alone anymore. They never had been. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to hope.